60 ducks went quiet, not slowly, not the way a flock trails off when the light changes, all at once, in the middle of an hour that should have belonged to mosquitoes and water. Mara heard it from the porch, the sudden absence of sound where there had been a low, steady argument of quacking for as long as she could remember. She set down the coffee she had been warming between her palms for 20 minutes and walked to the edge of the orchard. The water was high again. It always rose here in the early part of the year, the kind of seasonal flooding that made the valley look like a slow brown mirror. The orchard flooded the way a floor floods when the rug is too thick, unevenly, stubbornly, in the same low places every spring. Her boot sank to the ankle on the first step. Her second step landed on something firm. Her third did not. The water was shin deep near the eastern row, where the oldest pairs leaned a little, the way tired people lean on fences. Patch was in front. Patch was a limping brown hen, half feather missing from one wing, the kind of bird that should not have survived a winter, let alone led a flock of 60. She walked in a line, though, and the rest of them walked behind her in a line, bills dipping once, twice, into the brown water, and then lifting, as if tasting something the rest of the year had hidden. Mara had watched Patch long enough to know when the bird was hunting and when she was searching. This was not hunting. Mara went back to the porch and took the wooden survey pole she had pulled out of the barn that morning for no reason she could have named at the time. She carried it down into the water and walked parallel to the line, keeping 3 trees between herself and the ducks. 1 pole length, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At the 6th, the pole stopped as if it had hit the bottom of a kettle. She pulled it up, let the water drain off the end, marked her hand with her thumbnail, and put it down again. Same result. Same hard, flat refusal, as if there were a sidewalk under the mud. She counted. She stepped. She tested again. The ducks kept walking, single file. The way you walk when you are not sure of the way, but you are sure of the direction. It was the kind of afternoon that pulls the past forward. Mara was about 32, and she had been pulling her father's memory forward for nearly 20 years without meaning to. Her father had pruned orchards owned by other people for almost 30 years. He could tell a pear tree by the sound its branches made when wind crossed them in October. He could walk into a backyard he had never seen and know in a quarter of an hour which root was wrong. When Mara was 12, the orchard he worked was sold to a development company that did not grow things. The workers were given 5 days to leave the cottages along the southern fence. Her father had carried his grafting knife in one hand and a paper bag with a change of clothes in the other. Standing in the truck, he said the line she could not forget. We knew every tree. We just never owned the soil under them. She had been 12. She was 32 now. She understood more of it than she wanted to. The county auction was held on the second Thursday of March in a room that smelled of old carpet and radiator dust. The property was 14 acres, half a mile north of the bridge, with 1 collapsing shed, a fence that was mostly attitude, and 206 pear trees listed by the assessor as dead or non-productive, tax delinquent, seasonally inundated, drainage failure, unsuitable for cultivation. The opening bid was $10. The room was not full. The people who had come were the people who always came, relatives of the dead, neighbors who had heard a number, 1 man looking for a hunting lease, 1 man looking for firewood rights, and Cal Danner, who owned the largest commercial orchard in the county and had come because he always came, the way a hawk comes when something small is moving. Mara sat in the last row with $15 in her coat and her father's grafting knife in her palm. The knife had been in her coat pocket, the way a watch is in a coat pocket, not because she needed it, but because she could not put it down. The auctioneer read the parcel twice. The opening bid was 10. There were no bids. The auctioneer said 10 once more. Cal Danner turned in his chair and looked at her. He had a face that enjoyed what it saw. Careful, he said, loud enough for the room. The fish might demand rent. There was a small practiced laugh. Mara lifted her card. $15. The room laughed again. Mara kept her card raised. There were no counterbids. The auctioneer said 15 once, said going once more, and by midday Mara held a quitclaim interest in 14 acres of swamp and 206 pear trees the county had already decided were worth nothing. The deed was warm from the printer. Mara folded it twice and put it inside her coat on the other side from the knife. The same afternoon, a county employee drove out to her property in a white pickup with a red wooden stake in the bed. He planted the stake by the gate. He stamped it by hand with a wooden mallet. The stamp read, "Unsuitable for agriculture." He pulled out of the lane without looking back. Mara stood in the water near the eastern row until the last of the light left the bark. Tree number 187 was supposed to be removed. She could see just under the spot where a broken branch had been cut years before, a single green bud the size of a match head. She did not touch it. She marked the tree in her notebook. She wrote the word remove in capital letters and then closed the notebook and walked home through water that was still the same depth it had been that morning. Her boots left no prints. What the county did not know, and what Cal Danner did not know, and what the assessor had not known when he typed the word unsuitable, was that the same ducks were walking in a line across the orchard that night from tree 187 to the northern boundary, dipping their bills at the same spots, again and again. Mara stood at the edge of the water with the deed in her hand and the knife in her pocket and watched them. She did not say anything. The ducks did not say anything. Somewhere under the mud, 6 inches below the place where a man had planted a red stake to say that nothing would grow here, there was a straight, hard, deliberate line the length of a city block, and nobody in the room at the auction had ever heard of it. The next morning, the water over tree 187 was half an inch lower than the water over every other tree in the row. Mara was at tree 187 by first light before the air had warmed enough to lift the mist. She carried her father's grafting knife and a fold-out knife she had bought 3 winters ago for cutting twine. She did not believe the assessor. She did not believe Cal Danner. She had a stronger opinion than either of them, and it had been given to her by the same man who had taught her to hold a saw without bending it. She made a small scrape on the south side of the trunk, just below the broken branch. The bark came off in her hand like a strip of paper. Underneath, instead of the dry brown she had half expected, she found green cambium the color of early peas. She tested it with her thumbnail. It dented. It bled a thin line of sap. She pulled her hand away and looked at the row. She had 205 trees left to check. She checked them the way her father had taught her to check fence posts, systematically, on the same side. 7 of 206 showed green. 7 out of a county that had stamped a red stake by her gate and called the place unsuitable. Her kitchen thermometer said the air was colder near the roots of tree 187 than it was 2 trees away. She did not trust the thermometer in the field, so she did what any stubborn woman with a borrowed roll of string and a fistful of wooden stakes would do. She drove a stake at the base of 187. She drove a stake 2 trees east. She drove a stake 2 trees west. She ran string between them and walked the line, listening. Below her boots, under the water and the mud, she could hear something moving. Not the slow, lazy movement of a flooded field on a still morning. A current. A thin, deliberate, almost stubborn current. The way water moves when it has somewhere to go, and someone built it a place to be. She had no pump. She had no excavator. She had no drainage crew. She had the deed and the knife and a flock of 60 ducks. The flock cost less than a truck repair would have. The handwritten card on the cage at the farm closing said, "Mix flock, farm closing, take all." Mara took all. She loaded them in the back of her truck at dusk and drove them down the lane with the windows open. The next morning, the flock was already at work. They ate snails. They ate mosquito larvae. They ate the weeds that had grown up through the high water like a second, uglier orchard. Eggs appeared in the corners of the collapsing shed. 7 the first week. 11 the second. 19 by the third, when the ducks had decided which corner was theirs and which corner belonged to the rat that had been there first. Cal Danner saw her at the feed store on a Saturday. $15 ducks for a $15 swamp, he said, loud enough for the next 3 aisles. Mara did not look up from the bag of grit she was measuring. They eat snails, she said. They also eat money. The man behind the counter stopped what he was doing for a second and then decided not to laugh. On the 9th morning after the flock moved in, Mara came out at first light, and there were no ducks. They were not in the shed. They were not in the lane. They were not in any of the 4 corners she had been trying to teach them to use. She walked the bank until she saw them. Patch was in front. The flock was behind her. They walked in a single line from tree 187 toward the northern boundary of the property, and at every 5th or 6th step, all of them dipped their bills into the water at the same point, the way a row of carpenters pull a chalk line together. Mara followed. She kept 3 trees between herself and the line. Patch surfaced with something pale in her bill and dropped it at Mara's feet without looking up, as if returning a borrowed tool. It was a snail, but not a snail from the local mud. The shell was thinner, whiter, marked with a faint red spiral stripe. Mara turned it over in her hand. The mud on Mara's boot was thinner than the mud 2 trees over. It was also colder. She knelt and put the back of her hand on the surface. The cold came up through her skin in a slow stripe. She stood and walked the edge of the stripe with the thermometer. 5 degrees colder than the water on either side. 4, in a thinner band at the center. She looked at the ducks. The ducks looked at the water. Mara walked back to the porch for the survey pole. The pole found hard ground at 6 inches under the first duck station. The pole found hard ground at 6 inches under the second. The pole found hard ground at 6 inches under the third. Mara marked the line with stakes she had cut the night before from a slab of cedar in the barn. She pulled one stake out and dug with her hands. At a depth you could rest a tea kettle on, her fingers brushed a flat gray slab with a squared cut edge. The shape was wrong for any stone that had fallen out of the valley wall. The shape was the shape of a man who had decided to lay a sidewalk under someone else's field and then had never come back to explain why. The county survey map for the property showed nothing under the surface except the drainage ditch at the northern boundary. Mara walked to the place where the ducks had stopped at the far end of the line, near a stand of reeds she had been using as a windbreak. The reeds were old. They bent when she pushed them aside, the way a curtain bends. Under the reeds, half buried, was an iron ring handle, the kind that bolts onto hatch cover on a boat. She pulled the ring up with both hands. The slab under it came with it. There was a stone-lined channel under her orchard. The cover stones were squared. The water under the cover stones was black and cold. It surged up to her ankles and pulled north toward the drainage ditch at a pace you could measure with a piece of grass. In 2 days, she opened 5 of the cover stones. She numbered them with chalk on a wall of the shed. She measured the water inside each opening with a kitchen ruler and a piece of string and a kitchen thermometer. By the end of the 2nd day, the water at tree 187 had dropped almost 2 inches. The mud at the base of the trunk was dry enough to show the print of a thumb. There was a crack in the soil, thin as a hair, going around the tree like a ring on a plate. Mara put her hand on the bark and held it there until her palm warmed. "You were right," she said, and she was not sure whether she was talking to the tree or to the man who had taught her to scrape bark before she cut it. She went to bed that night with the numbers written into the back of her notebook in her father's handwriting, the handwriting she had copied so many times it had become hers. The numbers said the system was open. The numbers said the system was running. The numbers did not say anything about the crack. The numbers did not say anything about what would happen when she told a tree that had been standing in a flooded field for 40 years that it had been standing on a roof. She turned the lamp off. The lamp cord swung once, and the geese on the wall clock kept a kind of time that was louder than the time the ducks had stopped keeping. The crack did not wait for dawn. Mara was at the kitchen window when she heard it. Not a pop, not a snap, but a sound like someone stepping on a frozen puddle that has begun to thaw. She pulled on boots over bare feet and ran the lane. The water at tree 187 had dropped another 3 inches in 2 hours. The crack had widened. The roots under the surface had given up. Tree 187 fell across the flooded row, slow and heavy in the way a tired man falls into a chair he has finally admitted is his. Ropes that had been holding it to posts since before Mara owned the deed snapped like thread. The bank along the eastern row collapsed into the open channel, and the channel scoured as if someone had pulled a plug. By morning, the channel was half a foot deeper than the day before. Cal Danner filmed it from the gate. He did not come onto the property. "You draining it or drowning it twice?" he said into the camera. And the audio was good because the wind had died. The video reached half the county by the end of the week under a title he had written himself, $15 Orchard Falls Apart. At the feed store, the joke was already a joke. The $15 duck, somebody said, had found the quickest way to kill the tree. The man behind the counter laughed for the first time since the county had stamped the red stake. Mara did not go into town for 3 days. She packed straw into the bank of the eastern row. She closed 2 of the access stones with flat rock she had stacked against the shed in a previous life. She walked the orchard at night with a lantern, listening for the places where the water was still moving underneath. On the 3rd morning, when the wind had dried the mud enough to leave a print, she cut 3 small green shoots from a lower branch of tree 187. She wrapped them in damp cloth inside her coat against the warmth of her ribs. The way she had seen her father wrap signs for a 2-hour drive to a buyer, he did not trust. The truck that came up the lane on the 4th morning was older than Cal Danner's truck and far more damaged. It was mud-colored up to the door handles. The woman who got out was mud-colored up to her elbows. She was 56, which made her 19 the year the second channel had been drawn on a plan that nobody now admitted to having seen. "Did you open the drain?" she said before she had closed her door. "Or did you empty the orchard?" Mara told her the truth. The woman introduced herself as Ada Voss. She had helped clear the line when she was 19. She had spent 37 years since then maintaining the valley's irrigation ditches, culverts, and drainage gates, the boring, paid, unphotographed work that kept the valley from becoming a swamp or a salt pan, depending on the season. Ada did not talk about feelings. She talked about principles. A drain carries away what is in excess. A ridge slows down what is running off. A basin holds moisture through the dry months. The system had been built to stay balanced, not to stay dry. Mara had treated one part of the system as if it were the whole system. "Branches can lie," Ada said when Mara showed her the cambium test. "Check the cambium." The graft took 2 tries. The first cut on the young rootstock, wrist thick, live cambium showing, went too deep. Mara sealed it with cloth tape and pulled the tape off when Ada asked her to. The second cut was the right depth, and the scion sat in the cleft without rocking. Mara sealed it again. Ada brought from the passenger seat of her truck a stained maintenance copy of the original plan for the valley's waterworks. A corner was missing. The marks had faded, but the blue pencil of a younger hand, her own, was still visible. There was a second drainage channel drawn across the northern edge of Mara's property, beginning inside her western boundary, passing under the county road, running toward a low basin the size of a small pond that the county now called a retention area. The county clerk, when Ada called from the porch, said there was no registered channel on file. "We can only act on what is documented," the clerk said. Approval would take several months. A survey, an engineering review, an environmental sign-off. A storm was due in 5 days. The forecast was 3 inches of rain. Ada hung up the phone. "Paper is final until water disagrees?" she said. Mara did not ask permission. She rebuilt what she had pulled apart. She closed 2 access stones and narrowed the others with flat rock. She packed the banks with bundles of willow she had cut the night before and the straw she had set aside. She shaped low ridges along the rows where the water had begun to cut. She sowed rye and clover by hand in the mud that was still soft enough to take a seed. She moved the ducks in sections, the way a grazier moves cattle, and the ducks accepted the discipline without comment. On the eve of the storm, Patch led the flock again. This time they turned west, away from the restored channel, into the stand of reeds at the root mound near the county road. Mara had walked that ground 10 times and heard nothing. The ducks stood in the shallows and looked at her, the way a dog looks at you when it has something in its mouth it would like you to see. Mara took the survey pole. It sank 2 feet into the mud without resistance, then struck something solid. The blockage was 12 feet inside her fence, well before the road. She and Ada dug by hand. The mud gave up a collapsed timber frame. The mud gave up stones the size of bread loaves. The mud gave up a covered throat 3 feet wide. The mud gave up a fist of roots, a wad of black leaf pulp, a length of rusted wire, 2 crushed fuel cans, a broken bottle, and a fence post someone had driven straight down into the channel during a repair job in a previous decade. Not all at once, Ada said, and she stepped back and watched while Mara cleared, measured, and stopped before each new layer. The rain came at dusk. By morning, the channel was open as far as the property line. The fence post shifted an inch at the first rise, then pulled free. A surge came down the channel from up the valley, but the willow bracing held. Mara had marked the shed wall with chalk at the level of a yardstick she had laid across the threshold. The water fell half an inch in 10 minutes. It fell an inch in 30. By dawn, the orchard reappeared, row by row, the way a road reappears through fog. Tree 187 was on its side in the eastern row, and the graft Mara had carried against her ribs was alive on a young rootstock near the gate, its wax seal unbroken in the wind. Mara stood at the fence and watched the water leave. She thought about the man who had stamped a red stake by her gate. She thought about the man who had filmed the collapse and put a price on the failure. She thought about the woman who had come up the lane in a mud-colored truck and said, on a phone call, the truest sentence a county worker ever says, "Paper is final until water disagrees." She thought about the ducks who had not waited for permission and who were now eating snails on a bank that had not existed at sundown. There was mud on Ada's forearms. There was mud on Mara's forearms. The survey pole stood where she had left it, leaning into the channel like a man leaning on a neighbor's shoulder. The sour smell stayed longer than Mara expected. 2 weeks. 3. Then it thinned, the way a smell thins when the air has somewhere to go again, and the air found the roots, and the roots drank. The red shoots came up where the bank had slumped. Mara did not count them. The land counted them for her. 17 at first light on a Tuesday, 43 by Friday of the same week, on a piece of ground that the county had stamped unsuitable for agriculture. By the second week of May, she had stopped counting. The eastern row where tree 187 had fallen was lifting itself out of the mud in a thin red line that could have been a wound and could have been a sentence. The graft stayed closed for almost 4 weeks. Mara walked past it at first light and again at dusk. She did not touch the wax. The wax is a trust, her father had told her once, when he had been teaching her to seal a cleft and she had asked him why he did not check it. On a cold morning at the end of April, the wax split along the seam she had pressed with her thumb. Inside the split, a single green leaf uncurled, the way a hand uncurls when a child wakes. By May, the shoot had reached a foot of new growth. By June, there were 3 pale blossoms on a wood the color of weak tea. The university extension specialist came out at Ada's invitation. She was a small woman with the kind of boots you only see on people who have walked a salt flat in the dark. She walked the orchard with Ada, who walked her the way a librarian walks a reader through a stack of books that nobody else opens. The specialist stopped at the base of a tree the county had numbered dead the previous August. She scraped a patch of bark with a thumbnail. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the exposed cambium. These trees were never dead below ground, she said. The drainage failure hid what was still viable. Ada did not nod. Ada stood with her hands in her coat pockets, the way a contractor stands when the job is paid off and there is no need to say so. The county updated its records at the end of June. The new description said partially restored drainage, mixed age rootstock, active restoration. The red stake stayed. Mara did not ask for it to be removed. She had bought the deed with the stake still on the property, and she would keep it where it had been driven into the ground the afternoon she had become the owner of a swamp that nobody wanted. Cal Danner came back in July. He did not drive through the gate. He walked up the lane the way a man walks into a room where he has been the loudest man and has just been told the room belongs to someone else. Mara met him at the gate. He had the offer written on a piece of paper he had folded into his coat pocket. "I might be interested in buying more than trees," he said, and the number on the paper was larger than any number Mara had ever seen written beside her name on a single line. Mara looked at the paper. Mara looked at the eastern row, where the graft from tree 187 carried 3 small pears, smaller than a tennis ball, each one a different shape than the next. "The orchard isn't for sale," she said. Cal asked if he could see the drainage system. Mara looked at his boots. There was mud on them from somewhere. Not her mud, not this year's mud, but older mud. "You can," she said. "But clean the mud from your boots before you step into the grafting row." He scraped them clean on the gatepost and waited. The first pear ripened in the last week of August on the graft from tree 187. It was small. It was uneven. There was a russet scar along one side of the skin, like a healed cut. Mara left it on the branch 3 extra days. The rest of the tree had not yet turned. She watched the pear in the early mornings and in the late afternoons, the way a farmer watches a coop door she has just learned to trust. On the 3rd afternoon, she walked into the grafting row with a bowl and her father's grafting knife in her hand. She had not used the knife in months. It was the same knife she had held in the palm of her coat at the county auction, the same knife she had carried against her ribs when she had wrapped the scions in damp cloth and walked out of the wreckage of tree 187 with 3 green shoots and the rest of the orchard behind her, including the part she had killed. The hinge of the knife gave the same quiet squeak it had given when she was 12, and when she had been 12, her father had said nothing when she had cut her first graft, because the cut had been right. The pear came off the branch with a small, clean twist at the stem. Mara put it in the bowl. She did not taste it at the gate. She took the bowl to the porch. She cut the pear into 6 pieces the way her father had cut pears for her on autumn evenings when he came home with his hands stained and his pockets empty. The taste was not the taste of the pears he had bought for her from the orchard he did not own. The taste was sharper, thinner, more astringent, with a finish that held in the back of her teeth the way a sentence holds when you are trying to decide whether to say it out loud. Mara ate her piece. She put the bowl down on the porch rail. She looked at the gate. The first harvest that year filled 6 wooden crates. Ada came up the lane to help lift them into the truck. The university extension specialist came the following morning to take notes. The county clerk, who had said we can only act on what is documented, came out at the end of the week and walked the orchard for the first time in his life. Earthworms had returned to the rows. Frogs had moved in under the old shed, which Mara had decided she would rebuild instead of replace. Dragonflies were working the air above the clover. Wild ducks, not Mara's, not anyone's, had begun to drop into the channel at dusk the way swallows drop into a barn. The red stake stayed by the gate. The paint had faded in the places where the sun had hit it longest. The stamp, suitable for agriculture, had not been struck over it, and Mara had not struck it herself with a wooden mallet, and the county had not come back with a heavier one. The stake stood in the ground where a county employee had set it the same afternoon Mara had become the owner of a property nobody else wanted, and on the stake the words were unchanged, and the words were wrong about a moment, and the words were wrong about what was possible. Mara walked to the gate at the end of the day. Patch was in the lane, eating snails off the edge of the ditch. The flock was on the bank. The harvest was in the crates. The pear she had eaten was the last taste in her mouth, sharper than the pears her father had carried home in a paper bag. Mara put her hand on the stake. She did not pull it. She left it where the county had put it, and where the county had stopped, and where the land had decided to keep going.